Hello and welcome to Obscure History. Today's video will be the start of a wider series based on the largely overshadowed Seleucid Empire. Like many of the states which emerged from the Hellenistic age, the Seleucids are often a forgotten entity, which is somewhat surprising given that the Hellenistic era in general lasted for almost 300 years. It is only fairly recently that the study of this state, and indeed the wider time period, has had a surge in interest. The main goal of this series is to hopefully build upon this surge and to show that the Seleucids were an important power in their own right. This will be done via videos on the Seleucid monarchs, of which there are many interesting characters, and throughout them unravel the story and inner workings of this Hellenistic juggernaut. Starting this process off, I would like to dedicate this video as an introduction to the Seleucids by examining how the dynast's founder set himself up to be possibly the greatest of all of Alexander's successors. So with that said, let us begin this series on the Seleucid Empire. In order to better understand how the Seleucids came into being, we must first contextualize the world in which they would rise from. The main players which arose during the Hellenistic era found their start following the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, and the Seleucids were no exception to this. During the tumultuous wars fought between Alexander's generals, known as the Wars of the Successors or the Diadochi, the balance of power and alliances would constantly shift within the 40-year period these wars were fought. These have often been nicknamed as Alexander's funeral games, which I personally like, as these games would certainly be a bloody and deadly affair, where just one wrong move could mean the difference between glory and certain death. It all began with everyone justifying their various actions as being for the good of the dynasty that Alexander hailed from, named the Argeads, who had ruled Macedon since about 700 BC, according to the legends. Alexander's mentally disabled half-brother Arrhidaeus, crowned as Philip III, and Alexander's young son, Alexander IV, were hailed as joint rulers but were soon both murdered. As you can well imagine, things beyond that point quickly devolved into a complete free-for-all. With the exception of a few individuals, no one's position was secure enough in order to reunify the entirety of Alexander's empire. As we will see, however, that wouldn't stop some people from trying. If you are an average person living at this time, then odds are you will more than likely be affected by all the infighting to some degree, mostly for the worst off. However, there are some people that can operate and even thrive in these high-stress environments, and one such person turned out to be a man named Seleucus, who would ultimately carry on Alexander's legacy in the East. He would go on to have a few nicknames, but his most famous one was undoubtedly Nicator, meaning the victorious. The image shown on screen depicting Seleucus is a Roman bronze copy of an earlier rendition. Later Seleucid propaganda would boast of the close friendship between Seleucus and the legendary Alexander, but it was a common theme for his generals to claim to be his closest companion, as this was viewed as a form of legitimacy in the eyes of many. Like Alexander, there were legends written surrounding Seleucus's upbringing. For instance, his father, likely named Antiochus, supposedly told his son that his real father was actually the sun god Apollo. This would later lead the Seleucids to utilize Apollo as their patron god of choice, with many coins bearing his figure like the example shown. Seleucus also allegedly had a birthmark in the shape of an anchor, which would also allegedly be passed on to his descendants. Like Apollo, the anchor would also become a prolific symbol of the dynasty, with many cases of it appearing throughout the empire's history. When compared to the rest of the Diadochi, Seleucus rose to prominence fairly late in the campaigns of Alexander. If we use the accounts of Arian, a Greek historian writing in the 2nd century AD, who is the primary source for all things Alexander right up until the present day, then Seleucus begins to be mentioned more by the time of the Indian campaign of 327 BC. Here, Arrian relates that Seleucus was put in charge of an elite unit of Macedonian infantrymen known as the Hypaspis, which would have been a position of importance, and one where a great deal of trust was necessary between officer and king, but it seems he was never part of Alexander's immediate inner circle of companions. Once back from India, Seleucus was part of the mass weddings which took place in the city of Susa in 324 BC, where he married the Sogdian noblewoman Apama. For the future Seleucid dynasty, Apama served her purpose well, as she would give Seleucus 3 children, one of these being the future king Antiochus I Soter. Even though this was an arranged marriage, it seemed the two were genuinely happy together throughout their lives. Later Seleucid propaganda would openly and proudly claim that Apama was a daughter of the last Achaemenid king, Darius III, creating an illusion of continuity, but we know for a fact that she was actually the daughter of the Sogdian warlord Spitamenes, who at one point led an uprising against Alexander during his Scorched Earth campaign to pacify the furthest reaches of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Interestingly, many of the other Macedonians and Greeks who also married Eastern wives would end up divorcing them shortly afterwards, but Seleucus would remain with Apama, which in the long run would prove beneficial to the Seleucid dynasty, regardless of her falsified lineage, as their descendants would be able to claim that they had mixed genealogy made up of both Macedonian and Iranian, which would help them rule over an empire where the vast majority of people were ethnically non-Greek. During the conference of Triparadisus in 321 BC, which took place after the First War of the Diadochi, Seleucus was named as Satrap of Babylonia. This system was left over from the Persians, which was the name given to the governor ruling over a province or satrapy. Here Seleucus would rule as the military and administrative figure from the city of Babylon. During this time, Seleucus cultivated a close connection to the local people through generous gifts and reconstruction projects dedicated to the Babylonian religion. This also had the desired effect of placating the priesthood class in the city, as they held major influence over the common person in Babylon and much further afield. Like Egypt, the Fertile Crescent, of which Seleucus controlled a substantial portion of, was a region filled with settlements which were already ancient and well established. The area could provide a bountiful amount of harvest, which in turn meant high revenues, and was also connected to sea trade via the Persian Gulf. The area was also well connected to the land trade between east and west, as the Persian royal roads made travel easier, safer, and much faster. If Seleucus had dreams of establishing himself in his own right at this point, then Babylonia was the perfect launching pad. Seleucus knew when to make and break alliances at the right times. An example of this would be his dealings with another successor general, Antigonus Monophthalmus, meaning the one-eyed. By 317 BC, Antigonus was rising to become the premier successor, as he controlled a great deal of territory, including most of Anatolia and Syria. However, a constant thorn in his side was named Eumenes, a Greek who had been Alexander's chief secretary and was an open enemy of Antigonus. When fleeing eastward in search of building a coalition against the growing threat of the Cyclops, Eumenes stopped at Babylon to win Seleucus over to the anti-Antigonid alliance. With few troops personally assigned to him due to the satrapy normally being secure given its safe location, Seleucus was in a difficult position. Knowing that Antigonus's larger army was in hot pursuit behind that of Eumenes, Seleucus declined the offer and ordered Eumenes to leave his satrapy immediately. When Antigonus arrived in Babylon not long after, he aligned himself with the one-eyed general and offered his services. Once Antigonus had dealt with Eumenes in the east, he had assumed control over all the territories of Alexander's empire, minus Egypt and Macedonia. When Antigonus arrived back in Babylon, Seleucus received him warmly, but the relationship between the two soon turned sour. Knowing that Antigonus had a tendency to murder other satraps, particularly those further out in the east, Seleucus escaped from Babylon with his companions to Ptolemy in Egypt, where he became an admiral for a few years. At the same time, he dispatched messengers to Cassander in Macedon and Lysimachus in Thrace, who warned them of the impending danger that Antigonus presented. This would aid greatly in convincing the other main successors to form a unified front against the Antigonid cause going forward. After sufficiently supplying him with enough men, Ptolemy dispatched Seleucus to retake Babylon from Antigonus's representative in 312 BC. Here, his friendships with the locals and priesthood appears to pay off, as Seleucus managed to recapture the city and its two fortresses with relative ease. This event marks 312 BC as the official beginnings of the Seleucid Empire and the first year of the Seleucid calendar. Here on the map you can see the area Seleucus controlled as Satrap of Babylonia. Upon his return and recapture of the area, Seleucus was quickly beset by the neighbouring satraps of Media and Aria, who were still loyal to Antigonus. Knowing that his army was considerably smaller than that of his new rivals, Seleucus used his smaller numbers to his advantage by concealing them in the marshlands based around the Tigris River to surprise his foes. Evagoras, the satrap of Aria, was quickly dispatched at the beginning of the fighting. The news of the satrap's demise soon spread like wildfire until almost all the troops who only moments ago opposed him now pledged themselves willingly to Seleucus. Antigonus was too preoccupied in the western parts of his dominion, fighting the Third War of the Diadochi with Ptolemy and Cassander, and was unable to stop Seleucus's rise to becoming a contemporary player, one comparable to himself. The satrap of Media, Nicanor, managed to escape with a small force, but he too would soon meet his end following the defeat. It seems that the Antigonids had no idea of the extent of Seleucus's newfound influence over the eastern satrapies. The fact that Antigonus sent his son, the equally infamous Demetrius Poliarchetes, to retake just the region of Babylonia with a time limit supports this idea. Demetrius was able to storm one of the citadels at Babylon, but the second one proved too difficult to take. Leaving a meagre force to continue the siege, Demetrius went back west, having accomplished little success, with Seleucus quickly reclaiming anything that had been temporarily lost. Now, with around 20,000 troops at his disposal, and with the unified support of those who despised Antigonus, namely the troops who once served Eumenes, Seleucus had no further opposition left in the east. He easily took control of the lands as far as the Hindu Kush mountain range. With most of the eastern satraps now dead, Seleucus would assume direct control over most of these territories. Antigonus would eventually sign a peace treaty with the other successors, which meant he could solely focus on the upstart Seleucus. Known as the Babylonian War, we unfortunately have little surviving in the way of sources for this war, which is a real shame, as this would be the conflict to seemingly solidify Seleucus's position, and I for one wish there was more information available to us on the subject. Most of what we can gather is from the partial remnants of Babylonian texts, with the exception of a passage written by the 2nd century AD Greek author Polyaenus in his works called the Stratagems in War. This source records at least one major pitched battle that lasted for a whole day and went into the night still undecided. Seleucus ordered his men to sleep with their weapons and armor and eat their morning meal in battle formation. The Antigonid force, on the other hand, did not have the same level of organization, and when battle was joined once more, they were soundly beaten, giving the victory to Seleucus. Antigonus retreated westward, and both sides fortified their respective border with each other. This hard-fought defense secured Seleucus's hold over the east, with the universal hatred for Antigonus and his cause now absolute throughout the region, thrown in for good measure. In light of his newfound supremacy over the vast territory that fell to him, Seleucus would go on to found a new settlement named after himself, known as Seleucia on the Tigris. All the other major players, namely Lysimachus, Antigonus, and Cassander, had all named new settlements after themselves, so Seleucus was only following the trend which he would commission in earnest between 307 and 305 BC. Speaking of following trends, Seleucus would finally and openly declare himself king, which in Greek terms would be the Basileus, after the initial proclamation by Antigonus and Demetrius as joint kings of their own realm. As the name suggests, this new settlement was located along the Tigris River in Mesopotamia, just north of Babylon. Usually the idea of founding these new settlements was to relocate ethnic Greek and Macedonian populations to live in them. After all, they would typically have all the trappings of Greek architecture and facilities, such as the gymnasia, to give one example. There were many smaller settlements based around Babylon, and it seems Seleucus chose one of these to serve as the embryo for what he envisioned as his new capital. Seleucia would serve this relocation task quite well, and it would quickly begin to eclipse Babylon in size and population. This would in large part be due to the influx of new settlers moving into the area, but equally, if not more so, people would end up relocating from Babylon itself. Ancient records give us a max population of around 600,000 at its peak. Seleucia on the Tigris, for all intent and purposes, was built to be the civil and administrative capital of Seleucus's new realm, being located at the perfect crossroads for getting to the satrapies further east, whilst also close enough to be to the western boundaries to respond to any potential invasions from Antigonus, but for reasons we will get into later, this latter point would only prove to be a temporary issue. However, Seleucus would have little time to admire the construction works as a slumbering beast began stirring far in the east. His name was Sandracotus to the Greeks, but he is more widely known by his Indian name, Chandragupta. At the same time as Seleucus's ascent, another great power was rapidly expanding, unifying most of the Indian subcontinent in its wake. As its unifier, Chandragupta Maurya saw weakness in the divided petty kingdoms located in the Indus River Valley and knew they would be easy pickings for the Indian host. According to Megasthenes, a contemporary Greek courtier in the service of Seleucus, he notes the staggering military numbers under Chandragupta's command. This includes 600,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry, 8,000 chariots, and 9,000 Indian war elephants. Whilst these figures are almost certainly exaggerated to an extent, they do show us just how much of a unified front the Mauryans presented. Quickly overrunning whatever Greek presence remained east of the Indus River, it seemed that nothing could stop the Mauryans' advance westward. Racing to his easternmost border to meet the new threat, Seleucus marched his armies across the Hindu Kush for the first time, securing the lands to the west of the Indus River and thus coming into direct conflict with Chandragupta. Unfortunately, the 2-year period which encompassed the Seleucid-Mauryan War is largely shrouded in mystery due to the lack of surviving sources. Many coins with Seleucus's name have been found in the Gandhara region with the title Basileus, no doubt to help pay for the war effort. While we may not know the details of individual battles and events which took place during the conflict, it is clear that Seleucus was not able to achieve all that much. In short, it seems he met his match in Chandragupta, and by 303 BC, both sides had decided that further fighting would not be beneficial. A passage from Strabo lends context to the peace agreement between the two sides. Seleucus, for his part, would cede the territories that formed the easternmost part of Alexander's conquests. This included Arachosia, Gedrosia, and Gandhara. Seleucus would also give his daughter's hand in marriage to the Mauryan emperor, sealing a personal union between the two men. He would send Megasthenes to the Mauryan court on many occasions, most likely to act as an ambassador to the Seleucid king. In exchange for these concessions, Chandragupta gifted Seleucus 500 Indian war elephants. Having lost a lot of territory as a result, it would seem that Seleucus ultimately lost this engagement, but these same war elephants would soon play a vital role in the expansion of Seleucus's realm in the events to come. Events that he would have received word of during his stay in India. for the old Cyclops Antigonus was stirring up trouble in the west once more. During Seleucus' expansion eastward and the subsequent invasion of the Mauryaans, Antigonus was doing a pretty good job at being public enemy number one. The settlement that was put in place following the end of the Third Diadochi War in 311 BC would soon be violated. Even during the ceasefire, Ptolemy had been consolidating his hold over the eastern Mediterranean Sea by seizing control over important coastal settlements and islands such as Cyprus. This naturally angered the Cyclops, who resumed hostilities in earnest over these possessions. This would ultimately prove to be the beginning of the fourth and final war of the Diadochi. Antigonus would also put pressure on Cassander in Greece and Macedon, with Cassander's response being in the form of a plea to his northeastern neighbour Lysimachus, the satrap of Thrace. Having stayed for the most part quiet throughout the entire wars of the successors thus far, Lysimachus had finally decided that now was the time to throw his hat into the deadly arena of power. Declaring himself as an enemy of Antigonus, the satrap of Thrace mustered his army and crossed into Anatolia to threaten the centre of Antigonid power. By 301 BC, Antigonus was 81 years old, and with ailing health had to recall his son Demetrius from Greece to defend the heartland, leaning more on him to do most of the heavy lifting in the upcoming fight. Both father and son would link their forces, which according to Plutarch totaled some 70,000 men, as well as 75 Asian elephants. Hunting tirelessly to root out Lysimachus together with Cassander's general Plistricus and his men, the two forces would meet near a town called Ipsus, where all seemed bleak for the satrap of Thrace with his smaller force. That is, until a noise, sounding like thunder in the distance, began to be heard by both sides. The booming grew in volume until at last the source could be seen. Seleucus, Basileus of the Seleucid Empire, had marched all the way from the east with his army, Indian war elephants and all, to join Lysimachus in defeating the one-eyed Cyclops once and for all. The Battle of Ipsus would prove to be the final spectacle of Alexander's funeral games. Once combined, most historians agree that the Allies fielded a respectable force of around 62,000 infantrymen, with between 10,500 to 12,000 horsemen. They did, however, possess more elephants than the enemy, which were much larger in size compared to their Asian counterparts. Seleucus also brought a staggering number of war chariots from the east too, totaling 120. This battle would also see the first participation of his eldest son, the future king Antiochus, who would have been about 18 years old by this time. Battle commenced with the thunderous charge of the elephants from both sides. The elephant fight, as per the words of Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, was equally matched despite the size difference between them. At the same time, Demetrius launched an attack from one of the cavalry wings directly at the wing of opposing cavalry commanded by Antiochus. Demetrius was successful in his assault against Antiochus, who then chased him off the field. The infantry lines were also engaged in a bloody and indecisive action. Demetrius eventually returned to the main fight, hoping to circle around the enemy line to threaten their rear, but had found to his probable horror his path had been blocked by a solid wall of Indian war elephants placed by Seleucus. The Antigonid horses, not used to the smell of the larger breed of elephant, refused to advance any further, allowing for Seleucus to use the remainder of his elephants to wheel around to the side of the Antigonid infantry to threaten an encirclement. He also deployed his horse archers to further harass the enemy line at the same time. Morale on the Antigonid side now running low, Seleucus used the threat of envelopment to convince large portions of the infantry to switch sides to the allies. Hoping that his son would return to fix the situation, Antigonus tried to rally the troops one last time before being killed in a shower of javelins. Knowing the situation was lost, Demetrius fled, signaling the battle's end. The allies had won, in large part thanks to Seleucus and his newly acquired assets, and knowing how to use said assets to his full advantage. With Antigonid power now smashed to pieces, the victors were now able to redraw the boundaries of their respective realms. Seleucus found himself in possession of Syria, and by extension should have held possession over the large chunk of land to the south known as Colye Syria. However, Ptolemy in Egypt had taken the opportunity to claim much of that area away from the Antigonids for himself, as well as a good deal of the Phoenician coastline, despite not playing a role at Ipsus. This no doubt placed a dent in the friendship the two men enjoyed before, ultimately leading their descendants to fight for control over this region, but we will leave this for other videos. Whatever the relationship between Seleucus and Ptolemy had now become, by 299 BC, Seleucus made a risky gamble by aligning himself with the most unlikely individual, an individual who only a few years ago would have killed him given the chance. Demetrius was still at large, but he was no longer seen as the threat he once posed following the colossal defeat at Ipsus. At least this must have been Seleucus' thinking, as he was willing to take the risk. With an alliance sealed via marriage between his daughter Stratonike and the Seleucid ruler, Seleucus didn't have to lift a finger in order to punish Ptolemy for his presumptive takeover of the lands that were really his by right of participating in the Antigonid defeat. With a fleet still modest in size, Demetrius took to raiding Ptolemaic possessions, and Seleucus was all too happy to let this happen. It is unclear if Seleucus' Sogdian wife Apama had died by this point, or if she was still alive. Either way, it was not uncommon for Hellenistic monarchs to have multiple wives as per the Macedonian tradition, since the time of Philip and Alexander, and even before them. Finally at peace, Seleucus turned his attention once more to his other favourite pastime besides being at war, namely the founding of further cities in his new territory of Syria. It seems that the Battle of Ipsus had highlighted to Seleucus that his strengths were in his exotic units, such as his elephants and Persian cavalry corps, but was weakened by the lack of citizens who were trained in the Macedonian way of fighting. In order to help remedy this, and to attract further Greek and Macedonian settlers to his new burgeoning empire, Seleucus undertook the gargantuan task of establishing not one, but 4 new settlements at the same time, all within Syria proper. This monumental task shows that Seleucus was certainly thinking of the longer term by essentially creating further enclaves of Greek culture throughout his extensive holdings. In gratitude for the fresh start, many of these settlers would be obligated to fight in the army, thus forming the backbone of the Seleucid military, with the new colonists serving as hoplites and phalangetes. Now being the most western extent of the empire, it made sense to establish these new settlements in Syria, as these could be filled with settlers much easier than colonies further inland. These new settlements to spring from the Syrian desert were Seleucia Piraea, Laodicea, named after his mother, Apamea, and Antioch on the Orontes. This last one will be all too familiar with historian enthusiasts, as Antioch quickly became a major centre and would retain great relevance well into the late medieval period. Deporting the citizens from the nearby town of Antigonea, Seleucus demolished the settlement and moved them to Antioch. I'll let you guess whom that settlement was named after. Geographically, Antioch was built alongside a large hill, with the Orontes River running right next to it, with a position at the base of the Taurus Mountains, which was the barrier between Syria and Anatolia. Should an enemy army march into Syria through these mountains, they would first have to deal with Antioch with its ideal defensive position reinforced by its strong fortifications. The idea of this would be to keep the enemy occupied via prolonged siege, giving enough time for the main army to assemble and ultimately repel the invasion force. Antioch would grow rather quickly to become the new capital of the Seleucids, replacing Seleucia on the Tigris, as most of Seleucus' successors would be more focused on the west. It is mainly for this reason that the Seleucids are normally described as a Syrian empire rather than a Mesopotamian one. Even so, we should not forget that it was Babylon that got the empire off to its start. By 292 BC, Seleucus took further steps to secure his family's long-term future, Namely, he named Antiochus as viceroy of the eastern satrapies and effectively declared that he now held equal power to him. In reality, Seleucus would remain the chief figure in the power-sharing agreement, but in doing this he was signalling that he wished for his realm to pass to Antiochus without any fuss. This would set a trend for future monarchs, as Antiochus would do exactly the same with his son, and so on. Before raising Antiochus to the position of co-ruler, Seleucus and Antiochus would be involved in what we would see as a mass scandal by today's standards. In 294 BC, Seleucus had divorced Stratonike so that his own son could be married to her instead. Known as the lovesickness of Antiochus, this event would inspire many works of neoclassical art, such as the one shown on screen. I won't go into too much detail about it here, as I would like to save this for a video focusing more on Antiochus. Just know that on the face of it, this arrangement seems very odd, but it would seem Seleucus had his reasons for taking this action, once we take into account the wider events taking place. In the same year, Demetrius Poliorcetes was back on the scene, having found his way as king of Macedon. Not one to forget the power and influence he once held when his father was still alive, Demetrius gambled his ultimate comeback on one last expedition to reclaim what was lost. Conquering parts of Seleucia by 286 BC, after being harassed by forces loyal to Lysimachus, Seleucus found Demetrius right on his doorstep. Whilst the alliance at first was useful to Seleucus for getting indirect revenge on Ptolemy, he must have been pressured somewhat by the other successors to do away with this agreement. By giving Demetrius' daughter Stratonike to Antiochus, he was signalling that she now held less power as the wife of the heir rather than the reigning monarch. At first, Seleucus promised he would send aid on the basis they were once father and son-in-law, but he was actually playing for time in order to muster and station troops along the mountain passes leading into Syria. Despite the marriage alliance the two men once shared, it seemed that Demetrius was hell-bent on reviving the Antigonid cause, which Seleucus was well aware of, hence his preparation. Surrounded on all sides, cut off from supplies, and not receiving suitable amounts of payment, Demetrius' substantial army was soon losing men in droves due to pestilence and desertion, making him grow bolder and desperate in his decision-making. Trying to keep whatever remained of his forces intact, Demetrius launched them in what seemed to be a suicidal charge against the troops blocking the Taurus mountain passes. Not wanting to give him a sucker punch chance, Seleucus at first refused to engage with his main army. Partially for this reason, Demetrius was met with significant success at first, forcing his way through the smaller armies. Just when his hopes were starting to pick up once again, they were suddenly and finally dashed to pieces when Seleucus himself finally showed up with his main force. Taking his helmet off, Seleucus wanted the enemy to see that it was he himself who opposed them. Calling out to some of the enemy troops by name, Seleucus made his position clear that he was a generous and cunning leader of men who had earned the respect of his troops. Knowing all this to be truthful, the rest of Demetrius' army soon melted away, deserting en masse to Seleucus. Finally beaten for good, Demetrius was brought into custody, where he would later die of overindulgence. During Demetrius' time in captivity, Lysimachus had repeatedly sent requests to Seleucus that he should kill him, even going as far as to offer exorbitant amounts of wealth, which Seleucus refused each time. Whilst this would obviously cause tension between the two old successors, Seleucus knew that Lysimachus had become increasingly unpopular as king, due to issues within his own family, including the killing of his own son and heir Agathocles, who was by all accounts very popular with the army and people. Seleucus sensed that now was the time to be rid of his final rival and contemporary to Alexander. Marching his enormous army out of Syria, the two victors of Ipsus would meet on the plain at the Battle of Corpedium in 281 BC. By all accounts, this was a very one-sided affair, with Seleucus winning handily and Lysimachus being killed during the fighting. Following Corpedium, Seleucus found himself in possession over a good portion of Anatolia, further expanding the borders of his realm, this being the areas of Cilicia, Lydia and Mysia on the map. In an attempt to have some semblance of administration over this very ethnically diverse land, Seleucus was able to strike deals with the local dynasts who would acknowledge the Seleucids as their overlords. Comedically, it was reported that Seleucus was rather annoyed by the amount of correspondence he was forced to read from the various powers of the area who now swore fealty to him. Many settlements celebrated him as a liberator, such as Lemneos, whose citizens built a temple dedicating it to the Seleucid king. It also seems that he began the process of constructing several more settlements to further plant the seeds for Seleucid dominance over Anatolia. Now the undisputed successor of Alexander, Seleucus was now in the position to achieve the ultimate goal of reunifying the entirety of the Macedonian Empire, except for Egypt, which was now in the hands of Ptolemy's successor, Ptolemy Philadelphos. Seleucus moved quickly to secure both Thrace and then Macedon, leaving the administration of Anatolia unfinished. With no possible force to stop him, Seleucus crossed the Hellespont into Thrace, securing his foothold in Europe. Whilst travelling through Thrace, the army stopped to allow Seleucus to go on a hunt. Another of Ptolemy's sons, named Ptolemy Carinus, meaning the thunderbolt due to his bad temper, had been travelling with the old king as a companion following his exile from Egypt. During the hunt, they were riding together, and I would imagine Seleucus had no suspicion of Ptolemy's true intentions, as it seemed the older Seleucus took in Carinus, perhaps sympathising with the younger man's exile. With no one else seemingly around to stop it from happening, Carinus brutally murdered Seleucus like the thunderbolt he was, afterwards going back to the army and proclaiming himself as king of Macedon, thus ending the fascinating life of Seleucus I Nicator. As I have gone through the material of this video, I hope I have shown that it is impossible to explain the Seleucid Empire's rise to dominance without discussing the exploits of its founder within the events he lived through. After all, Seleucus' story is very much about the foundation of a great state which would outlive him for over 2 centuries. As a shrewd diplomat, he was able to operate fairly inconspicuously, for the most part, when people who were higher up the chain were killing each other left, right and centre for the ultimate prize. Always one for dreaming big, his ambition would pay off big time, being rewarded the lion's share of Alexander's empire as a result. He would be known for his prolific building projects long after his time, with Antioch being the pinnacle of his legacy. Even when the Arsacid Parthians descended into Mesopotamia following the decline of the Seleucids, Seleucia on the Tigris would still be a capital city and an important hub of trade. Making his way from a secondary to a primary player in dramatic effect within the Hellenistic version of Game of Thrones, Seleucus was a person who could inspire and command the loyalty of those who followed him. More importantly, he was able to maintain this loyalty when most other armies of the time could very easily switch sides without a second thought. As I have shown, he himself was no stranger to utilizing his charisma in order to utilize this very tactic. As most modern historians have come to realize, the Seleucid monarchy only held power thanks in large part to the loyalty of his troops and his own personal ability to lead those men from the front successfully, and Seleucus certainly placed the bar sky high for his family. By all accounts, by the time of his murder, Seleucus was rather old but still in good physical and mental health. Once Macedon was secure, we know that plans were well underway for him to take control over the rest of the Greek mainland. No doubt he would have then turned to face the final independent power of Egypt, who at the time was ruled by Ptolemy's other son Ptolemy Philadelphos, as mentioned earlier. Had he lived another 5 years or so, I think it would have been possible for Seleucus to reunite the entirety of Alexander's empire under his family's rule. In my opinion, it is definitely one of the greatest what-ifs of the Hellenistic age, and possibly much further beyond that. Unfortunately for him, that would never happen, and knowing what happens next, this would be the last time someone would try. Regardless, Seleucus certainly deserved the fitting title of Nicator, the Victorious. I hope you have enjoyed listening to this introduction on the Seleucids. They are certainly one of my favourite entities in history, and I plan on making many more videos on them, so be on the lookout for further content. Next time, we will look at how Antiochus will take up the mantle of king and see how he fares with keeping the behemoth empire together. If you have enjoyed this video, why not leave a like and perhaps a comment? Until next time, this has been Obscure History.